Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Audio Tools Explained. Today, we're going to be going over some basic processing units that are used for music production, film, sound design, stuff like that. We're only going to get into some of the basic effects today. The next episode of Audio Tools Explained, we will be getting into the more complex effects, and we're probably going to have a couple more episodes after where we go into more detailed explanation. For now, we're just going to focus on some basic effects, so I hope you guys are here for a good fun ride because we're going to get into it right away. Now, up on the screen here, I have Nuendo open, and I have these instruments loaded onto it to help demonstrate. I have a strummed guitar, which is the session guitars from Native Instruments. I have the Adagietto violin legato from 8DO. I have the Scarby J bass, which is another 8DO instrument, and then I have the Epic Toms Ensemble, which is another library from 8DO as well. Now, I'm going to be using these for just purely demonstration purposes. Feel free to play around with the processing units we're about to go through on your own time to better understand them. Today we're just going to be going over some basics and how you can use them for your music or for your post-processing or for sound design, for any of your audio-related work. And if you are a filmed director or if you are a game designer and you're doing a lot of your work by yourself, this is also really good information for you to know because this will help. Tools like these will help you bring the audio quality up, which will in turn bring your entire production value up as well. So there are a lot of audio processing units or effects. We're going to start with some of the basics. We're going to start with a couple more popular time-based effects, which we call reverb and delay. Now, we're going to start with some delay, and I feel like the best way to actually demonstrate delay is with a percussive instrument such as these toms here. So let's go ahead and load up a delay plugin. We can start with the stock one because it will be probably the best one to learn on. Stock instruments are usually pretty common all across the board. They do have slight variations, but for the most part, all plugins that are the same, all delay plugins, all reverb plugins, all your other effects will be pretty similar across the board. This is a stereo delay plugin. Now, what delay does is it's actually super simple. You can probably guess what it does by the name. It takes the sound that is sent through it and it plays it back again at an interval that you can decide. So you can decide to play it back a few milliseconds later. You can decide to play it back an hour later. I wouldn't recommend an hour later because it really has no practical effects, but you can. This is a really common effect for music production that is paired a lot with percussion because it helps give the percussion a bit of an extra feeling, but it is also great for producing effects such as an echo if you're trying to replicate like a really big open space. Say you're working on a film that has a scene shot in the mountains and you need to replicate an echo. You could use a delay plugin to use that. There are actually some plugins out there, some effects that are specialized just for creating echoes. But you could get pretty much the same effect with a delay and a little bit of reverb. So to demonstrate here, I've soloed the toms, and this is what our toms sound like right now. Now that little playthrough was pretty simple. Literally took me 5 minutes to write up all these little MIDI tracks for these instruments. And that was it dry. I've loaded up the delay plugin now, and we can listen to what it will sound like with, say, a eighth note delay on one side and a quarter note delay on one side. And we'll turn the low filter up and see what it sounds like. Let me know if you can hear the difference. pretty obvious, right? Now, a delay plugin doesn't really have a lot of complexity to it. So you can learn all of the functions pretty easily, and pretty much all of the functions will be the same across all delay plugin and effects units. You will typically have a length of delay. This is a stereo delay track, so it actually has two, one for each side, left and right. And you can either sync that to the tempo of your digital audio workstation, but you can also turn the sync option off in most delay units and actually have it delayed by milliseconds. So if you want to really, really customize it that way, you can. The sync option is really, really useful for music, and the not synced option can help you customize things for film, for sound design. It can open up a few more options. It gives you a few more delay options because when you sync it up, it locks it to the grid, and the grid lengths aren't necessarily what you want depending on the circumstance. The mix knob is just the mix of the original signal mixed with the delayed signal. The more I turn the mix knobs up, the more of the delay signal you get, and if I turn them all the way down, you just get the original dry signal. A lot of units like these, you'll have to play around with the mix, figure out where it sits right for you. As always, trust your ears, ask for feedback from fellow artists if you are unsure, but generally just do what sounds the best to you. It's all art. It is your choice. The next one that we're going to go over for the delay plugins is this feedback knob. Now, I'm going to turn the mix all the way up to demonstrate how this one works. So typically, any delay plugin will only duplicate the sound coming into it once. It will only delay it once. The feedback option allows the delayed signal to feed back into the beginning of the processing unit, effectively letting you delay it as long as you want. If you turn it all the way up, you could keep the delay going forever and ever and ever. If it's all the way down, you'll only hear it once, such as. And if you turn it all the way up, you will get it going on forever. Right? It sounds really, really weird. It's still going, actually. So that's what that does. And if you notice, if I put it, both the mix and the feedbacks around 50% for each side, you kind of have this midway. Obviously, that's not very musical. I don't even have the sync delay on right now. But that is the purpose of the feedback knob. It feeds back the delayed signal back in again to be delayed again, and that signal is then fed back in. Each time it loops, the signal gets a little quieter, and how much quieter it gets is actually dependent on the feedback knob as well, because the higher the setting on the feedback knob, the louder the signal is that's put back in, but it will always be getting just the tiniest bit quieter because it is designed to stop eventually. Some delay plugins will have the low filter option, not all of them. Some will also have the high filter option, but again, not all of them. Some of the delay plugin effects that are out there are pretty simple. But basically what this does is it filters the sound before it comes in to be delayed. This is very useful for music mixing and sound design, especially because a lot of times you don't want the low ends to be delayed, especially if it's a stereo mix, because that will create a whole bunch of muddiness in your mix, right? The same goes for creating a mix for film or for games. You don't want a lot of low-end frequencies in the stereo imaging. You want it all in the middle. So what this does is it actually cuts out any low-end frequencies from being delayed and helps keep that bass in the middle instead of going out onto the sides and messing with your mix, right? The high filter does the same thing, except for the high frequencies. It cuts out the high frequencies, and this is more of a creative option, I find, for a lot of people, because maybe you don't want 18 kilohertz delayed over and over again. Or maybe you just want to use the low filter and the high filter together to just have that middle set of frequencies delayed, right? If you only had it from around 500 to around 10,000, right? That would be a completely creative choice, right? Some delay plugins will also have these pan knobs, which allow you to decide where that delay is going. This is a stereo delay plugin, so by default, the one on the left is panned all the way to the left, and the one on the right is panned all the way to the right. You do have the option to change this because you may want to. Who knows? You may want to get creative and have the delays do some sort of crazy thing. You can also automate that and make it super crazy and spacious. But in general, it is a good idea just to keep them straight left and right, unless you're super, super progressive with things, right? Not a lot of people will change the way that the panning goes. Generally, it's just left and right. You can change it to be less left and less right, which would be the only application of those knobs that I would personally recommend, but the option is there to change it around. Now, just to get a view of what some other delay plugins might look like before we move on to the next unit, this is what's known as a ping pong delay, which is another form of delay that instead of having two separate channels that are operating independently of each other like that last stereo plugin had, this has one channel that is constantly going from left to right and will always have only one of those channels active at one time. So it'll ping pong back and forth, right? I will actually demonstrate that for you right now. Now, if you can't hear it quite yet, I'm going to turn the mix up here and you can kind of hear what I'm talking about, but it's actually alternating between left and right. So there are a lot of delay effects out there that will have a ping pong delay setting or a ping pong delay preset in them. Now we're going to go on to the next time-based effect, which is reverb. Now reverb is super, super, super important, but it's also very, very fickle. Reverb is one of those effects that is very, very commonly overused in both music production and any sort of post-production. Of course, when you get to the pro levels, it's not overused because the pros know how to use it. But if you're just starting out and you're just discovering reverb, you have to be very, very careful with it because it can, if used improperly, cause you a few problems in audio quality. Now, basically what reverb does is it creates a simulated reverb of for your audio that you are playing in your DAW. Any sort of audio you bring in, MIDI instruments, it creates reverb, right? Reverb actually functions kind of similar to delay. It is super, super fast. You can actually take a delay plugin and play with the settings and create reverb with the delay plugin. It's very, very tricky, but you can do it. What the reverb effects have done is simplified that. So don't ever try to build a reverb in delay unless you want to get super creative, in which case I highly recommend trying it out just to explore. But I've loaded up one of these stock reverbs that Nuendo has called Roomworks, and this is what it looks like. And I have it on this strummed guitar here. And I'm just going to disable the reverb here just to let you hear what this strummed guitar library sounds like. I'm actually going to make sure that it doesn't have any onboard reverb turned on as well. So this is what the strummed guitar sounds like without any sort of processing. You can hear how that sounds like it's in a studio space, like it was recorded in a studio. There's not a lot of room reflections coming into the microphone. It's very, very dry, which allows you to do a lot of things with it. You can put it in pretty much any space you want. Now, here's what it sounds like once we've turned the reverb on. And let's give it almost 3 seconds of reverb. Let's give it a bit of an accentuated reverb. We'll give it 50% mix, and we'll put this low filter on it as well, just to cut out any lows. This is the same kind of settings that you'd find in the delay. They're just filters for your input signal, right? So let's see what that sounds like now. It sounds like it might be in a stadium. Like there might be a guy on a stage a few hundred feet away who is playing guitar, and he's plugged into a whole bunch of speakers, and the speakers are playing in the stadium, right? And then that delayed you're hearing, that delayed sound of, oh, this big open space is the sound of the guitar bouncing off all those walls until it reaches you, right? So this is a time-based effect. All it's doing is altering the signal, looping it around, delaying it a whole bunch in specific ways with specific frequencies, and creating a simulation of that space. Again, reverb plugins are pretty simple. Once you learn one of them, you can pretty much use all of them. They are all slightly different and may have slightly different options, but they all have the same basic things across the board. They will all have a sort of reverb time, or most of them will have. There may be some reverb effects out there that do not have an option to change the time of the reverb, but for the most part, they will have a reverb time option. Now, all this does is changes the length of the reverb that you get when a signal comes in. Now, I had it up about 3 seconds, which sounds like this. But if I put it down to, say, half a second, now it just sounds like he's in a big room, right? A good way to think about it is the longer the time, the larger the space. So think about where you're putting this audio or where you're putting this instrument in your mix, and you'll be able to kind of envision in your head how big the space is and how big the reverb should be for it. Size is another function. It's very much different than reverb time, but basically what it does is it helps narrow in the size of the space that you're putting in. A larger size will have a slightly different sound than a smaller size. It is slightly difficult to hear. We might not even be able to hear it once I've increased the reverb time drastically. There is a slight difference there. It is very slight, and you might not be able to hear it right away, but after you start using reverb all the time and you start training your ear a bit more, you will be able to hear it. The smaller size does make it sound slightly smaller because it's not producing as much reverb. It's not feeding the signal around back into itself as much. And this will make it sound a bit smaller or a bit bigger depending on how much it's feeding itself into the reverb, right? Pre-delay is a pretty standard one across all reverbs. Basically, it is the delay between when the signal hits the processing unit and when it is pushed out of the unit. So if I have a pre-delay of half a second, you could hear there was about a half a second delay between the first sound of the guitar and the first sound of the reverb for the guitar. This is a function that you use to help emulate the space once again. A larger space where the instrument or the source of the sound, if you're not writing music, is farther away. If the source of the sound is really, really far away, it will have natural pre-delay on it. And if it is a much, much larger space, even if the instrument's right in front of you, there will be a bit of pre-delay as well. So it's very, very important to play around with these settings and learn how they are used. Diffusion is another important one. Not a lot of reverb effects will have a diffusion setting. if I set everything down here, what diffusion basically does, you can think of it as it blurring the reverb more. If I have no diffusion on my reverb, this is what it will sound like. If I have the max diffusion ever on my reverb, this is what it'll sound like. Again, we'll accentuate the reverb time a little bit to see if you can train your ears a little bit to spot the difference, but there is a difference. There is a bit of a difference. And diffusion is kind of similar to size for what it does, but it is a different sort of processing. Basically, it increases or decreases the simulated diffusion of the area that you are placing the audio in using this reverb plugin. It is kind of difficult to understand if you're just starting out, but think of it as if it's a much larger space, maybe a bit more diffusion. If it's a really, really small space, maybe less diffusion, but still have some in there, because diffusion will occur naturally in any room, and it will occur much more naturally in any room that has a lot of corners or edges or reflective surfaces, right? So if you have a lot of concrete, it's going to have more diffusion. If you have a lot of like really hard objects like steel, metal, it's going to have a bit more diffusion. But if you have really absorptive material that is like foam, or I don't know, wood is really absorptive as well, it's going to have a little bit less diffusion because it's absorbing the sound. Width is just the stereo width of the reverb. You can have a mono reverb. It's really weird. It sounds like this. Right? So that basically takes all the reverb, puts it in one channel right in the middle. And the more width you have, the more stereo the reverb is. It's a really, really useful option that more reverb effects units should have. And it all really, really is useful for music mixing, because maybe you only want reverb on this one instrument coming from that channel over there or that channel over there, right? Maybe sometimes you don't want a stereo reverb, and it is a very useful option to have. Now, there are a lot of other knobs and dials here, and I'm just going to go over them briefly. This is just input filters, similar to what was on the stereo delay. They'll filter out certain frequencies before they hit the reverb. Reverb, because it is another time-based effect, normally you don't want a lot of sub-frequencies under, say, 100 to 150 hertz. Low frequencies when they're stereo or really delayed will mess with your mix and create a lot of mud and really just overpower everything else. So generally, it's good to keep the bass or sub-frequencies just in one location right in the middle. Over here, you have dampening effects, which will dampen the reverb, which is a fancy way of saying it will filter out certain frequencies after the reverb has been processed and put on the sound. It's kind of like an output filter, but slightly different. The envelope function is not common across most reverb effects. Basically what it does is it is a ADSR of your reverb. It's an attack, decay, sustain, release. You can change the attack of the reverb, how long it takes to reach the max volume of reverb or the max amount of reverb, as well as the release, which is kind of similar to the tail of the reverb. And you can have the amount of this modulation changed using this mod up here. And as always, you have a mix knob over here. And then RoomWorks has this really, really fancy efficiency knob, which I've never played around with. Normally, I just leave it on default if I'm using this plugin at all. Really, you only need to focus on this section here, because that section will have all of your main reverb settings. Everything else will be different across each plugin. We're going to go over another pretty basic one really quick. Anybody who's worked with audio at all will know what an equalizer is, or an EQ, and they're very, very important for working with any sort of audio, any sort of sound design. If you've worked with audio, you need to learn how to work with an EQ properly. I'm going to demonstrate this one with the legato violins as well as the toms, because this will help understand how frequencies work over a broad spectrum. Cubase and Nuendo actually have a really, really cool built-in processing chain on pretty much all their channels, but I am going to be using a audio insert. So when you first open up an EQ, you will see something very, very similar to this. Depending on the design, it could look different. I'll load up another one just as comparison. This is a stock one from Nuendo. It's called Studio EQ. So you can see it's kind of similar. It has this display here. FabFilter's Pro Q3 doesn't have that immediately as you load it up, but it does come available. These other knobs down here. But let's just load up another one to kind of give you an idea. Let's load up, say, sure, this. This is a different style of EQ. The ones I've actually have loaded up here are multi-band. This one has a set limit of bands. So in FabFilter Pro Q3, I can actually go through and change these frequencies that I'm EQing. I can create one here. I can move it over there, etc., etc., etc. In this one, I have just a few knobs to look at that represent frequencies. So it's a little different. Even in Studio EQ, you can change what frequency is being modulated by which or which EQ point. That's a pretty common feature in a lot of equalizer plugins nowadays, but some won't have it. Sometimes you'll be working with something like this GEQ10, where you only have a few knobs to work with that will help EQ your sound. But they all function the same. What an equalizer does is it either lowers or raises the volume of a certain group of frequencies of your choosing. That is what an equalizer does. Now, this is the sound of the violin before I've done any EQing. So that's just straight out of the box. There hasn't been any sort of processing done on that at all. As you can see, this EQ had a little graphic display of the frequencies as the instrument was playing. That is very, very specific to this EQ. Not a lot of other equalizers will have that option. It is very, very useful if you are the person who thinks visually, who needs some sort of visual input for their work. Not a lot of EQs will have that. Now, this is something that is purely creative and all up to what you hear as the best sound for the most part, because EQing, while it is very, very important for your mix, there are a lot of creative things that you can do. Personally, if I'm mixing strings into my mix, I like to have a high shelf on, kind of around the 5 or 6, and just boost that a few dB. And I like to cut out anything around 350, 400 by a few. It's a subtle difference, but when you're mixing it in with a whole bunch of other instruments, especially full orchestra, it helps bring out the strings a lot more because it gives them some high-end definition, and it cuts out some of their mids where a lot of the brass and the woodwinds will be playing around. So you could kind of hear the difference between the EQ'd and the not EQ'd sound there when I bypassed the effect. Now, I'm going to load this up on the toms as well. Get rid of all these effects plugins I had there. Get out of here, effects. Welcome new effects. Now, this is what the toms sound like without any sort of EQing. Now, as you can see, they take up a much wider section of the audio spectrum than the violins do that we were watching previously. And this is why EQing is so important, is because if I had those two instruments together along with a few other instruments, or I may want to take out certain frequencies from the toms to help other instruments also fit well in the mix and prevent any sort of overlapping frequencies. So I may take out those mid frequencies. As you can see, that made the toms automatically sound a lot boomier, a lot deeper. And I didn't necessarily turn up any frequencies. I just cut some out, and it already improved the sound creatively for what I was going for. Right? With the EQing, without it. And you can see how once you've actually taken those frequencies out and then I added them back in, you can kind of see how those frequencies were actually somewhat unpleasant once I added them back in. And one of the main purposes of an EQ is to cut out unpleasant or unwanted frequencies. And this will help the overall quality of your sound come through. And that is the purpose of an EQ. It's just to boost and cut sounds. Before we get into the actual settings down here, if you are using an EQ, my best advice would be to cut out unwanted frequencies first before you start boosting any frequencies, because it's kind of a common rule of thumb that when you cut frequencies, your goal is to make the sound better. You're supposed to remove unwanted stuff, and if you're boosting things, you want to boost it after, because you only want to boost frequencies that will improve the sound. To get into the quick settings of an EQ, it really is very, very simple. They will have a gain function, which determines how much you're either boosting or cutting the sound or the frequency that you have chosen. They will have a frequency knob, which allows you to change the frequency that you are affecting from the lows to the highs. That EQ I had up before, the GEQ10, does not have a frequency setting because all of the frequency bands that you can edit are preset in here. It will have a Q setting. Now, what a Q setting does, I'm going to make a pretty drastic boost here to show you. A Q will affect the width of the change. So right now I have a default Q of 1. If I make that Q down, you can see the range of frequencies I'm affecting grows and grows and grows. And if I put the Q really, really up tight, it really, really narrows it down. So really tight Qs like this are very, very useful for cutting out frequencies that are resonant or unpleasant or really, really stand out. Some instruments and some sounds will have these really, really annoying resonant frequencies that once you cut them out, your ears just automatically go, oh my God, finally, thank you for getting rid of that. That is very, very useful. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a really, really high Q for boosting because it can generate an artificial resonant frequency and really, really make something unpleasant. Generally, I'd go for a little bit of a wider Q for boosting. Maybe something around, what's that, a 4? Yeah, maybe a 6. You don't really want really, really tight Qs for boosting. They're really, really useful for cutting. Then a lot of EQs will have a type of boost available. A bell is the most common one. It just looks like this. It looks like a bell. There will also be shelves for your low and for your high. This is just a shelf boost of a very, very large range of frequencies. They will also have cuts, which will cut frequencies either below a certain frequency or above a certain frequency. This is a low cut, so it cuts frequencies below a certain frequency. This is a high cut. It will cut frequencies above a certain frequency. Notches will notch out a certain frequency or group of frequencies of your choice. And a bandpass is kind of like a filter, but both high-end filter and a low-end filter at the same time. It's kind of for narrowing down a certain range of frequencies that you want. There's also a tilt shelf, which is kind of like the bandpass, has the low cut and the high cut put together. A bandpass has the high shelf and the low shelf put together, but it tilts them so that they're going in opposite directions. Some equalizers will have the option to change either the entirety of the sound or just certain parts of the sound. FabFilter Pro Q3 has the option to either change the stereo part of the sound, or the right, or the left, or just the mid, or just the side, which is a really, really creative way of really honing your skills with Reverb. If you want to get super, super crazy, you could have dozens of bands on this, each one affecting the side or the middle or all of it together, right? I really hope you guys found this informative. These skills are super important for any sort of audio processing. We are going to be covering all the other effects units in future videos. However, I got to cut this one here because we're running out of time. But I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next one. Hopefully